The Ornamentalists, Escaping Entropy Part 3. Zaji, an aquatic fish that can be seen as easy to piss off and has a low temper. It's usually considered hostile. They have tooth-like spikes growing out of their back with the same spikes inside their mouth for teeth. Not much had really been done after everything had been transferred to this dimension. It was impossible to bring anything from the old dimension into this one, so everything had effectively been set back to the beginning of time. So much time had gone by that it was useless to try and go back. The old universe was uninhabitable by now. Time passed hundreds of millions of times faster where they had all moved than it did in the old universe, so by then the whole thing should have collapsed in on itself. It's okay though. The legendary 20 seconds had been years ago. The story of heroism and eventual collapse being told and passed down among the generations of new species being born and raised in the new dimension. A story about 548 years passing while only 20 seconds passed in the new universe. Time passed 864,086,400 times faster here than in the old universe. Even the blink of an eye longer would have resulted in the death of everything. Billions of organisms would have died, each knowing that there would be no good ending, no hope of ever seeing light again. Humans broke away from the Comlugs, even deliberately prohibiting Comlugs from entering their territory. No Comlug understood their reasoning. It just seemed that humans were just naturally discriminatory. On one side of the mountain lived the Comlugs, and on the other were the humans. The humans had taken about 60 square kilometers to themselves, but since their population was still so low, it was pretty empty. Especially since the outbreak at Cliff Claw had claimed so many human lives that the casualties were hard to count. There had been multiple movements to combine the primal groups together, but none of them were successful. Humans even tried to naturally select to become less discriminatory, but it hadn't worked either. Toledo wanted to visit her old village just south of Diamond Falls. There had been a river running through the center of the mountains, probably taking millennia to carve out the valley that had been there before anything from her universe had seen it. It was risky to go back, since the viral outbreak that occurred recently might not be over, and also the continuing threat of the Zajis. Toledo missed looking up at the side of Cliff Claw to see all the alien plants growing up it. She wasn't very advanced herself. The most that humans had done after their old universe closed was make a rope and primitive printing press. There were deposits of ink and other substances that could be used in the presses, but a water source was far more useful to live next to. The planet that the creatures had moved to was bigger than Earth, maybe even twice as big, but the strength of gravity in this dimension was halved. So there was more space, but the planet's size didn't make anything twice as heavy. Apparently the weight of some materials were the same as what they would have been on Earth, but since the tectonic plates were way larger, the mountains could form as high as they wanted. No one really knew how other universes work, including this one, but they just had to work with what they had then. The discoveries would come later, but back to Toledo's old village. She wasn't the chief or anything, but she just loved living there. A village on a plateau wasn't as visually pleasing, even though the view from off of it was stunning. She deemed that the Zajis should have backed off by the time she would head down, so it should have been safe to go. And hopefully if she only visited it for a short time, she would have been safe from all the disease that ravaged the village when she was little. That's why they evacuated in the first place. She didn't really care though. A home was a home. It was pretty. She would only be going there to look at it again and experience the nostalgia. Even though she had never lived on Earth, her great-grandfather did, and if she was going to judge what he had told her about the place, the landscape was pretty flat and lame compared to the mountains that were common on this planet. Kind of like her new village, but her new village was located on a plateau with cliffs, maybe thousands of meters tall. She never wanted to go anywhere near the edge, despite a wooden fence built from rope and alien wood similar to aspen. It was a parallel universe, but it wasn't that different from the one before. It was just like 20 times more interesting to look at, since the tectonic plate size difference shifted the landscape dramatically more than they did on Earth. But if she wanted to head back to her village, the first thing that she needed to do was head down the side of the cliff. There was water at the bottom on the west side, but she knew that falling 1,000 meters into it would kill her. If not the impact with the liquid, the Zajis would. So her only option was to either parachute down or go down the stairs, which had probably been dampened from the constant fog in the air. She didn't trust the leaf parachutes, though. There could have been holes already forming. She looked over the edge of the cliff, seeing the tiny forms of the people that had fallen off the staircase. The plateau wasn't the tallest thing in the mountain range, but it was still really tall. The other ones that had reached above it had cool overhangs and roots that penetrated all the way through the surface. Her tribe was even working on making a bridge to another one of the larger, flatter mountains. There weren't any kind of awesome floating rocks. After all, this isn't a fantasy story by any means, but at least there are some strange cases that have rocks connected to vines that dangled between mountains. There was one on the opposite side of the staircase, but the staircase went down through the mountain and popped out to the other side on its way down. She placed her foot on the first stair fearfully. She knew it really wasn't worth it, but she wanted to see it again. It had been 20 years. She waved goodbye to the tribe's people. They stopped in their tracks and waved back. She stood close to the wall as she headed down the stairs. Luckily, it wasn't a slope because they had already been slightly dampened from the amount of water in the air. There weren't really clouds, just a cool and constantly moving fog. Chapter 10. Cliffside Village. As Toledo continued down the stairs, she looked out to the right to see the mountains down the mountain range, and then she looked forward to see a vast flat land of plains and ravines. There was another mountain range maybe a few kilometers to the east that linked up with her mountain range, so she could see some other human tribesmen among the tops of the trees in the forest to the northwest. She was on the opposite side of the valley in which her old village was located, and since this was the correct path, and there weren't any mountains lower than where the path was right now, she needed to turn left to go into the mountain. The path was at least 40 years old, so she was able to access the top of the plateau before the Zodgies in the water got fed up with the humans' existence next to them, constantly using their water for their needs and then contaminating it with strange substances. Typical human behavior. The plateau was nice, but it didn't have access to the trees that they would need to build their houses with. Toledo turned into the mountain, passing the thin wooden barrier that had been constructed to keep the humans from going in. The Zodgies weren't that bad. Seeing the darkness of the tunnel that connected each side of the mountain made her feel nostalgic. It popped out at the bottom of the mountain that her village was at. Toledo didn't really take this route that much when she lived down in the valley, but sometimes she would go up to the plateau and look out over the plains just to watch the forest move with the winds. And she watched a bonfire take place one night underneath some northern lights that happen every 10 days. Swinging her legs off the edge of the plateau and looking up, feeling nothing but comfort and the warm feeling of belonging. Every night the sky would have a different shade of blue or purple before it went completely dark. Sometimes it was red or magenta, but that was rarer than the deep bluish purple that would usually fill the sky. When the northern lights came, their bright blue-green ribbons scattered the same color around the forest. The forest moved and danced with the color, shifting with human and alien folk song alike. It felt good to be alive. Toledo would especially like it when she and her friend Juniper would run through the trees in the valley, arms out, letting the leaves smack their faces as they squealed happily into the forest. One time they found a rock stacked next to a waterfall, which they would go to sometimes to bathe next to and jump off all the small cliffs next to the magma-warmed water. She would try to head there too, saving the best for last. She popped out of the tunnel looking into the large-leaf trees again. They almost made a canopy over the village. It had the same cool feeling that it always did, a soft moisture always present in the air. The valley would have felt much colder without it. It was formed from the waterfall that Toledo and Juniper had discovered uprange. So far, nothing too crazy about this dimension had been discovered except for the gravity and the electricity thing, of course. The planet didn't have a name yet, but they always called it Palm. She continued into the village, looking to the mountainside of the southwest mountain to the familiar playgrounds that dotted the side. It was steep, yet they still managed to stay connected to the walls. The walls of the mountain were completely dedicated to children to climb up, and when one person ran out of space to build what they wanted to, they would just link it up with another. The village sat how it used to be, wooden cabins and thatch huts sitting around the snaking pathway. Toledo continued through the village, wanting to find her old house to try to get some things out of it and move up to the plateau. She didn't want the Zodgies getting angry at her sounds, so she tried to stay quiet while they worked on whatever they needed to work on beneath the water. She didn't know if the Zodgies were from this dimension or from hers, but she left them there anyway. She had learned that trying to be nice to those creatures wasn't very useful. Around the corner, she could see her house, but someone was already there. In the window, a mannequin, staring at her, and she looked into its eyes to see it looking back, following her. Then she heard some movement across the pathway. New perspective. Zirkle hated this. He watched their painful eyes as he brought the spoon up to one of their mouths. The soup slowly drained off the spoon into the mouth of whoever was inside. Their throats were dry, but Zirkle could not hear the soup slip down them. It was impossibly quiet. He hated every little bit of it. They all loved it, having their one chance to experience something other than the painful stillness of the top room. Zirkle needed to help them. He liked that, but knowing that he couldn't get them out of this torture was in itself another form of torture. "Hey!" Treff said. "There's one coming right now! Go out there, see who it is. If it's another human, bring him in." Zirkle walked outside shamefully, wanting to tell whoever it was to just go away. Maybe they wouldn't even come here, but Treff counted on him bringing them in regardless. Hopefully he wouldn't need to give another bath. New perspective. It was a calm look. The smiling creature turned to face her as she quickly tried to remember how to translate their crackles into her language. "Hello?" Toledo called in Lugic toward the Comlug. It was staring at one of the buildings, then it turned to face her. "Oh yes, human? I thought moved out little bit ago." Toledo was fluent in Lugic, so it didn't take her long to translate what it said, and then put the strange grammar into an understandable context. "I'm just a visitor. I just came to look around a bit." "Wow, good to hear. This place pretty hostile. Why'd come here?" "That's why the barrier was there, right?" "Yes," said the Comlug. "The Zaji's very angry. Shouldn't be here. My name's Zirkle. Yours?" "My name's Toledo. Nice to meet you," she said. He stuck out his right arm and Toledo shook it. "I would like to show you something, Toledo," Zirkle said, looking regretful. "Is everything okay? You look kinda sad, Zirkle," she said. He stopped, looking at her with a deep stare from all three of his eyes. He didn't know what to say. "Just be careful, Toledo." New perspective. Wow, it looks like Zirkle's actually bringing her in. What a surprise. I thought he was the kind to shoo them away. We might need to give him an award for actually being obedient this time. Treff laughed. "When he gets back in, the first thing we should do is open the door to let him go hang out with those stupid mannequins. Every time we make a new one, all he wants to do is be around it." The whole group laughed in a chorus. Zirkle could probably hear, but it wouldn't be that big of a deal if the human heard. She was coming in regardless now. She would just think that the others were Zirkle's friends. Treff heard the door open and ran to go escort the human to the bathtub. New perspective. Zirkle didn't want to be a part of anything anymore. He just wanted to switch with someone that looked like him. It was hard to handle, but what Treff said was always partially right. He tried not to look up to that Comlug too much. Fuck this, Zirkle thought. He knew he'd be executed if he didn't follow Treff's instruction. This group was supposed to focus on getting humans and Comlugs back together and stop being segregated, not to punish them. So many protests had already occurred to stop xeno-segregation, but none had been successful. Some had even been arranged by the humans. All that Treff was doing was only perpetuating the hatred against each group. Maybe Zirkle could finally wall up the access to this place if he could get away for enough time. He was a pretty good sculptor and could sculpt the wall to the cave back in place so nobody would ever know it was there. Then maybe he could run away into the vast expanse of the forest of the planet. Maybe then the Ornamentalists would finally accept that they're not put on this planet for a reason. If the Ornamentalists banished Zirkle from being a part of this group, he would just do more against them, so the only way to get out of it was death. None of them were put there by God. They were just like the others, and everyone knew it. Toledo would just be another one to add to their collection. He hated it. She didn't do anything. Not even discrimination can be punished this badly. Why would they think that this was beneficial to them, or to the people that have to suffer through their punishment? Doing this to people is not God's will. This is just bad. What kind of God would want this? This is their own excuse to do this. Even the Lugic village disagreed with what they were doing, but had no way to locate their main camp just over the waterfall. "You can go up into the top room, Zirkle," Treff cracked with a smirk as the door closed. Zirkle wanted to kill him. In any way he could find, Zirkle wanted to kill him. The only thing stopping him were Treff's devotees. It's hard to believe that such people could exist, but Treff was very charming and hard to put down. Zirkle knew that he was just doing it to get more Comlugs to join his cult. And you can't just leave one without major consequences. Zirkle took the time he was given to his advantage, so he used it. He headed up to the stairs of the primal house to the attic. He opened the thatched door to see the mannequins. He didn't bring any food this time, but he wished he could. Hopefully the plaster wouldn't make them use more energy than when they stood. He wished he could lay them down, but Treff wanted them strictly to stand. Zirkle could see how much pain they were in. It was sad to watch them die like this, even if they'd never die. The eyes looked out from the plaster silently, unable to use their functioning voice boxes and everything else. If they ever got out, the first thing they would do would be to join each other together in their long-awaited deaths. The plaster prevents them from dying, and without any food it shouldn't be possible to extend a life so much. Each of them had been told that it was possible to live forever, and as it turned out, Treff was right. But this was not how it should ever be. The first thing that would happen if Zirkle cut their restraints would be death, but none of them really wanted that, and Treff used this weakness of Zirkle only to strengthen the cult, so they could only think and watch. But living forever is nothing when lonely, so Zirkle was their only happiness. They wanted to watch the trees grow with the infinite time that the plaster gave them. That was another strange feature about this dimension. Other than the copper loop generating infinite amounts of energy which couldn't be used at the time because they were still in the primal phase, that was the only anomaly in this universe that they had found. The plaster almost seemed to stop aging completely. Plaster was the only way to describe this substance. It was a white liquid that could be found when rocks were crushed up with clay and then mixed with water to harden. If the mannequins had enough strength, they could have broken out of the plaster if it was thin, but Treff gave special instructions to the cult to layer the unconscious victims with at least 30 layers. Zirkle went straight to the back of the room to sit on the bed. He shifted slowly through the mannequins, sitting down at the bed at the front. He placed his middle legs across his back ones, and his arms held up his head. The mannequin's eyes shifted toward him, and he looked back at them, not enjoying this anymore. If he was going to save any of them, breaks like these would have been the time to do it. But he would need to run away if he was going to attempt it, and Treff knew he wouldn't. These people still had lives to live, and Zirkle was the kind of Comlug that couldn't just save a few. It was time to sleep. Zirkle walked to his hut that used to belong to a girl named Shkalu before she moved up onto the plateau. Zirkle looked up at the blue sky as it darkened. If the pattern stayed true, there would be northern lights tonight. It happens every 10 days. He was going to sneak out. Hopefully there weren't any devotees in charge of guarding the building. He'd be freeing the people on the good night, and they would get to watch the ribbons of vertical green-blue lines wave through the sky as they die. It would be beautiful. That is, if he wasn't discovered. Zirkle had a nice dinner when he reached the cabin. The time between when the Comlugs needed sustenance had been greatly decreased in this dimension, but it was nice to eat a dish of food every night. Sometimes he would hunt with the rest of the Luggett group that wasn't part of the cult. Their village was just over the waterfall, but sometimes Treff would forbid him from going there if he was naughty enough. Zirkle was seen as a troublemaker, and was almost always watched more often than the rest, but maybe no one would be out there watching for him tonight, and instead be out watching the light show. That was uncertain. Zirkle waited until he couldn't take it anymore before he got up and started wasting even more time to wait into the night. Waiting so far into the night to go raid that something seemed familiar. If he failed, there would most surely be a lake of his own blood around his severed head that night. The Ornamentalists were serious about violations of their own policies. A rock guillotine had been constructed in the wall of the cave behind the building to remind almost exclusively Zirkle of the consequences. The only thing he could think about was what he would be doing a few hours later. He looked over the almost bamboo banister that blocked him from falling to the first floor and out the window to see that the ground was already shifting with color. It was beautiful. He wanted to go out and watch it too, but he needed to stick to his motives. These people were in genuine pain, and he wouldn't be forgetting about his pseudo-comlugs in the basement. This was the worst part of the Ornamentalists. This was the punishment that they had come up with for humans that discriminated against comlugs more than others. Zirkle didn't even want to look at them, let alone let them out of their prison of 6 completely functioning arms, but he knew the only way out of it for them was for them to be killed off. He wanted them to see the outside one more time, but he knew that he probably wouldn't have enough time for that. Zirkle walked down the stairs, trying not to think of his own limbs as human arms, fingers not wrapping around each stair as he made his way down. It was horrible to think about, so Zirkle stopped thinking about it. Painful even for him to imagine. Like transforming a creature with 8 legs into one with 20, or one with 6 into one with 4, a normal number for humans to have. He walked out of the front door, looking up into the sky. The lights flowed beautifully, slowly, and brightly, and Zirkle quickly sped along the trail toward the building. He was very quiet. He could see the familiar light of the village in blue-green that shone through the trees that faded almost all of it. In some places there were light wells where there had been a shot of dust somewhere nearby. It was like a geyser for dust. Zirkle could see the building up ahead, and he looked into the window to see the mannequin staring back at him, wide-eyed. Chapter 11. Freed. Zirkle continued, looking around to see nobody. The building looked more menacing than ever. He looked up to it, and then up into the trees to see the northern lights snaking through the sky. He stopped in front of the door, gently lifting an arm to push it open. New perspective. The Zajis were done with the comlugs' constant drama. The Zajis were just fish, but it still annoyed them nonetheless. They wanted to just go up and destroy the comlugs' village. The humans were more annoying, cutting down trees and talking way more, but the comlugs posed way more of a threat to their water. What was all this red and white liquid that they kept dumping in? They didn't know, but it made it hard for them to breathe, and they had the capability to stop it, so you bet they were going to. It was even worse than what the humans had put into it. Treff waited for the moment he would finally be here. The northern lights to him were nothing except a pattern. They didn't change any schedule. He would have gone through his schedule the same. Northern lights or not. The comlug didn't know what part of the planet he lived in to have northern lights show every 10 nights, but apparently there had been more snow northwards. They had been positioned somewhere near the equator due to snow falling only 2 days of the year at most, which made him slightly question why northern lights were literally happening at the lowest they possibly could in the world. But that was only a small thought anyway. He wouldn't even let it take over him while he slept, because the only thing that he was thinking about when he slept was how he would attack the human village. But Treff had to go in steps, and as he waited for Zirkle to come through the door, that's all he could think about. And sure enough, a few minutes later, Zirkle lightly stepped through the door. It was so easy to tell that he would be coming tonight. "What? How did you get here?" Zirkle said, trying to not look suspicious, but Treff could see the stiffness in his neck from fear. "Don't think I didn't notice that look in your eye when you walked by me yesterday and today, Zirk," Treff cracked, stepping in front of him before he could even enter. "I knew what you were doing the entire time. Why would you not be coming tonight? You know what this means for you, don't you?" Zirkle didn't move, and then he shifted. Treff was fast. The comlug reached out to grab Zirkle, but he ripped his arm out of the grasp before Treff could even touch him. Treff jumped forward to get some speed to maybe catch up with Zirkle, but Zirkle was using his arms now to go as fast as he possibly could, pressing backward with every muscle in his limbs. Treff knew that anything fearing for its life would be faster, so the comlug put its all in as well, running up next to Zirkle to tackle him. Treff had gained some strength from always doing his job, but Zirkle just sped up. It was hard to see through the shadows, but Treff could see him hitting the light wells and knew where to go to catch up to him. It lunged at Zirkle, knocking into the comlug. He was sent rolling across the soil. Treff latched to him. Zirkle batted at the comlug as it reached its arm around his neck and squeezed. "You were going to free them, weren't you?" Treff said calmly. "The #1 rule, Zirkle, and you just had to go and break it." Treff cracked, cocking his head as his words increased in pitch. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Zirkle cracked with his choking air. Treff looked at him, confused. "What is?" I don't know, Treff. Look forward, he said, smiling. Treff looked, not seeing anything, but on closer inspection the Kamlug could see something, which caused it to loosen its grip. It was just an illusion, though, and Treff's mind was playing tricks on itself. Zirkle placed its back legs on Treff's underbelly and pushed it down the hill that led to the water below. Treff flailed out to try and deal a final blow to Zirkle before the angry Kamlug fell into the water, but again Zirkle dodged it as he caught his breath. It tried to claw its way back to the surface of the hill, but the dirt slid out of the way into the water just too quickly, and the harder Treff tried, the faster it slipped away into the water below. Zirkle stood up, watching the water as the angry Zoggies came to fill in. Treff tried running sideways, but that only made him lose his footing and fall. He was in the water now. Zirkle waved the Kamlug goodbye as it tried to squirm away from the angry sharp-toothed fish, but it already failed. The tip of Treff's arm had already been chewed off, revealing the carbon bone structure beneath. Treff could feel the fish taking chunks out of its torso and chest, feeling their teeth scratching Treff's bones. It looked up into the sky, looking at the blue-green ribbons lashing at him like whips. The Zoggies struck a vital vein in Treff's neck, and it started rapidly pumping light gray fluid into the water. Treff struggled to move toward the river bank, but as soon as it placed an arm on the sand and dragged itself out, it was already bleeding out. Treff was now laying in a pool of its own light gray blood as the fish continued to chew through its back legs, which were still dangling in the water. Its left antenna was gone, which made it dizzy. Treff looked upward at the aurora in the sky as it swirled into a downward spiral toward the dying Kamlug. New perspective. Zirkle knew he would be in trouble now that Treff was dead, but the mannequins and the pseudo-Kamlugs were still inside. The day was already starting, and the rest of the Ornamentalists would be there soon, so Zirkle hurried toward the building to finally free them. Zirkle opened the door, and as soon as it closed, he felt safe. "You're here a bit early, Zirkle," one of the guards cracked. Zirkle looked over to see her drinking some tea. "Good morning, Cam," Zirkle said, looking nervous. He had to tell her because if she found out on her own, it wouldn't be that hard to just go around to the nearest village to find him. "Cam, I have to tell you something. This may or may not mean that I will have to die," he said as Cam leaned on the small island in the kitchen, giving him the side eye. I killed Treff." She didn't move. Zirkle knew that this would for sure end in his own death, probably by a noose, but he had to admit it. Then her top eye widened. "You serious?" she said. Zirkle looked down, then he nodded. She looked at him and placed her arms around his shoulders. "Is it true?" she said menacingly, but her eyes danced with glee. Zirkle wasn't really watching. Zirkle nodded again. "You want to know something, Zirkle?" she said, leaning on his shoulder. "He roped a lot of us into this. I know there are a lot of people here that may or may not be actual devotees, but me, man, I'm on your side," she said, getting Zirkle to look up. "Now let's go release those goddamn innocent people. I'll protect you," she said. Zirkle quickly taking action and going back to the room. He opened the door, looking in at the room full of completely still people, each one coated in over 30 layers of plaster. Zirkle laid them all down, then smashed a rock into each of their arms, cracking the plaster. He ripped it off, throwing it over to the corner of the room until everyone had been released. Nobody moved, not even after Zirkle instructed them to. Were they dead? Zirkle looked at him. "Hey, Zirkle," he heard in a weary voice call from across the room. It was a croaky, and the language tripped the desperate Kamlug up a little bit. Zirkle rushed over to her. "Take care of my house," she said, and her eyes closed. Was that Shkalu? She had been there the entire time, and Zirkle didn't even notice it. Her eyes did always look the most friendly. It was time to go release the pseudo-Kamlugs. Zirkle didn't want to look back at the dead mannequins. He had killed them, each and every one of them. The plaster had protected them. He saw the pain in their eyes when he removed it, but the pain in his own heart made him continue. They needed to not live like that. He did a good deed. It was a good thing. A good deed. Killing everybody he had ever made friends with, because the Ornamentalists had stripped the ability to make friends with other Kamluks. A good deed. Now it was time for the pseudo-Kamluks to die. It's no wonder that the doings of the Ornamentalist cult would result in death. He stepped down the basement stairs, smelling the horrible stench of dried blood and rotting food and human meat. He could see the 6 armed figures standing up slowly to look at him. Since they had their voice boxes removed, the only thing they could do was whisper and crack like a Kamluk. He entered the room, looking down, slowly reaching up to grab a knife on the wall. The creatures shifted to look at him, and as the door closed, the light from the sun outside shone in, and Zirkle could see the horrendous creatures all looking at him. 6 arms, 6 hands, what were they? Zirkle muttered sorry to each of them, putting his arm on their cheeks before he cut their throats. Each and every one of them. None of them backed away. Every single one was ready to accept death. Every single one silently awaited it, needed it. But the very last one looked at him differently. She was the one that he had brought in. She was the one that he had felt he needed to protect. It was Toledo. And she leaned forward with her neck out just the same, and Zirkle slid it, looking into her eyes and watching her smile as she fell down to the hay below. She didn't do anything to deserve a punishment, let alone the worst one. Zirkle walked back up the stairs to see Cam still sitting there. None of the cult had arrived yet, and Cam walked outside with Zirkle, watching as the last of the Aurora Borealis faded away into the daylight. That night, both of them would be heading up to the top of the plateau to sit on the edge of the cliff to inadvertently watch the first ever double Aurora Borealis. Chapter 12, Secret Base. After a while of awkward silence and staring into the sky, Zirkle spoke up. "Cam," he cracked softly as he swung his back legs off the cliff while looking up into the sky. "Out of all the people that could have been on my side, it had to have been you? What are the chances of that? I would have never expected that." "Yeah, but what are we gonna do now?" Cam cracked. "I don't think they'll mess with me anymore. Since I killed Treff, you never seemed to be on their bad side, so I bet you could just stay and not be a part of it anymore." "Who'd want that? This place already brings back too many shitty memories." "Yeah," Zirkle said, laying down on the plateau to let the cold wind brush over him as he looked back into the northern lights. "You ever wonder how those get this far down toward the equator of this planet?" "Sometimes," she said, leaning back onto her right elbow. "Our star must have a lot of solar flares." Zirkle sat up. "Solar flares?" "Yeah, that's how they're formed. It's really weird how it happens, but it's a mixture of magnetic fields and lots of dust from the star. You know how solar flares can disrupt magnetic fields? Hence, blackouts on Earth, or any planet for that matter. But the solar dust sticks to those magnetic field lines and is brought back to the planet, and is lit when those molecules collide with molecules from our atmosphere, so they're making their own light. It isn't reflected by any other light source because it is a light source." "Slow down, Cam. I lost you when you asked if we were gonna run now." "Of course you did," she said, letting her arm fall back so she could lay down as well. "We should really go to bed. What are we doing here?" New perspective. "Light the fucking fire already! Okay. They're up. They're watching the sky. What if they look? I don't know. They'll probably try to stop us. It's fine. Just light it already. We have to do it tonight. Let them watch it. You realize this is my plan? Sorry, Neckel." New perspective. "You're right, Cam. We should head back," Zirkle said, sitting up, looking over the mountains one last time to smell the warm smoke of a campfire. There was a hint of an orange burn from beyond the silhouettes of the trees. He stood up, watching as it grew. "Good night," he said, turning to head back down to the other side of the plateau to walk back down to the village above Diamond Falls. Cam remained in place, settling to sleep there as she shifted to get comfortable. As Zirkle walked down the mountain, he looked to the left at the campfire he saw earlier, seeing that it had grown. Zirkle looked closer, seeing the walls of a house, There was another fire slightly up the hill on the other side, and he could see that it was on a house. Zirkle ran up the hill to go get Cam. She had already been coming down, so he didn't have to go far to find her. They knew that this would happen sometime. "Cam!" Zirkle cried quietly. "This is because of me, isn't it?" "Yeah, it is," she said back to him as they both continued down the mountain as quickly as possible. The forest was dark and hard to navigate, but the northern lights helped them a lot. They walked in the general direction of where they saw the fires from on top of the hill. Both of their antennae moved in the air, searching for the scent of fire. It came from over to the left, so they turned, staying as silent as possible as Cam muttered insults to Zirkle. He accepted all of them. Zirkle should have just brought the mannequins all out and left. Maybe then this riot wouldn't be happening. The fire came into view as they could see bright orange light fade in over the horizon, and Zirkle stopped. "You go help the people here while I go try and follow the remainder of the Ornamentalists," and before Cam could say anything back, Zirkle ran into the woods. Zirkle walked for a while until he could smell the unshowered scent of the Ornamentalists, so he followed a thin trail he had found on the ground of sticks and leaves that had been slightly parted from the others in the yellow grass. Zirkle didn't care how loud he was being, so he crossed over the red, purple, and blue leaves without even trying to be quiet. He needed to be quick because he knew that they would also be retreating. He followed the trail for hours, so long that the sun had come up during his quest. Maybe he had followed the wrong tracks, but the scent seemed to stay the same. He grew tired but would not stop until he found the end of the tracks, and soon enough he did. There was nothing else at the end of them. They just stopped in a dead end. Zirkle looked around the foliage surrounding the circle he had been in and heard a sound in one of the bushes, instantly realizing that this was a trap. He took off running back, seeing that the tracks had been covered up. He didn't care. He'd rather get lost than get an arrow in his head. The bushes shifted and the rest of the Ornamentalists came out of them, not armed with anything. They surrounded him. He had just as much artillery as them, but he was far outnumbered, so he just stood in the middle of the circle as they closed in around him. Neckle had blocked the path directly behind him. Zirkle dreaded looking at Neckle more than he dreaded looking at Treff. He and Neckle had come from the same litter. The exact same litter. That's why their names sounded so similar. Neckle looked at his brother with evil eyes. "You came here to stop us, but this place was built to protect us from people like you. We have mapped every single human village within their territory. We will take down all of them," Neckle suddenly cracked, startling Zirkle back onto the ground. "What did they do?" Zirkle hissed back, standing back up. "What did they do?" Neckle repeated. "Oh, what did they do? What did they do? I don't know. Maybe cast us out of their lives completely. Maybe they're unfair monsters, taking more land than they could ever care to populate. Maybe they've killed thousands of Comlugs, and maybe they're sending spies, and literally trying to take over the entire planet. See, the Hemopols don't have this problem, and neither do the fucking Zajis. The humans don't respect personal space. They don't even respect anything. What do they expect us to do? Act natural about it? No. So you stop your bullshit save the day act and choose a side. Join the humans and stop living with the Comlugs, or join the Comlugs and shut up. You've been messing this up for too long. What's the point in all of this violence when we could just leave? You guys were supposed to bring the people back together. You're the ones that started the movement. Why did the fucking Ornamentalists start plastering and combining people? What is this going to do? How will it help?" Neckle paused, arm in the air, ready to continue his history lecture. "They don't know their place, Zirkle. If they did, they would fight back and they'd show us that we are wrong, but they haven't yet. We're only forcing them to show that they are equal to us, along with a little punishment because of their constant discrimination against us." "And this is how you come back to show them?" "Yes, Zirkle. You don't get it, don't you?" "Of course I don't. I don't understand why killing them and tormenting them is better than sticking to the movement to get us back together. You know that violence will just make this worse, don't you?" "Just take him. He's on their side. We can't change his mind." And then Zirkle all of a sudden collapsed, not even seeing what hit him. New perspective. Cam had successfully brought the humans away from the village, and she brought them far. At first they didn't want to follow her, but then they realized that it was she that had helped them escape the fire. Then they keenly catenated her into the woods. She had brought them away for hours, until the sun rose on the land. They walked until their feet were tired, and Cam made sure to give them frequent breaks. They had all the time in the world, but during one of her breaks she watched as the blue and red trees shifted. She looked back, seeing a Comlug with a small dagger approach from the wilderness. "Retreat," Cam cracked quietly as she stood still, staring at the new Comlug. The people all slowly walked until they were far away enough that Cam could stop the new Comlug before it could attack anyone. It was Yugo, another member of the Ornamentalists. "Hello, Camkyo," Yugo said, spinning the dagger on his arm. "What are you doing here?" Cam cracked, monotone. "Seems like you already know," Yugo cracked calmly, and Cam heard one of the people behind her scream. She turned around, watching as Drugan came up from behind and tackled them. Yugo ran up behind Cam and raised the dagger above his head, swinging it down upon Cam's shoulder. She cracked out as her head raised. She quickly turned around and batted Yugo in the head, knocking him to the ground. She climbed on top of the Comlug and pressed her hind leg across his neck, preventing him from biting her as she choked it. Yugo struggled to get her off. "You thought you could beat us with 2 people?" she cracked, pressing harder as the Comlug's eyes welled up. A drop of Cam's blood landed on its chest from her shoulder, and she raised the bottom left arm up to it and lightly dabbed at it. Yugo did not reply. It just fruitlessly kicked at her. She pressed harder on its neck. "Why?" she cracked, forcing, and through a mouthful of saliva the Comlug replied, "Sorry." But Cam wasn't taking it. "Sorry?" she purred. "Is that all you can do? If your ass wants to get out of here, you have to stop resisting and tell me what you're so fucking sorry about." But the Comlug did not respond. Cam pressed on its neck harder, leaning almost all of her weight onto her leg. The Comlug choked harder, arms grasping around hers as it tried to press her off, but eventually it stopped. But Cam wasn't done. She held its neck for 30 more seconds just to make sure that the little shit was dead. She lifted her grasp, watching as its throat decompressed and sucked air into it. She watched for a little more and then stood up, looking back to see the humans beating down Drugan. "Split up!" she cracked over the raging mob pummeling him, and they opened up so she could enter the circle. She squeezed past, reaching up to the dagger in her shoulder. She pulled it out, not breaking eye contact with Drugan. "Hey, hey!" Drugan cracked. "I surrender! I won't tell anyone, just let me live." And Cam stopped, the knife above her head, and then she said, "Fine, I'll spare you, but as soon as I see any signs of Lugic existence back here in this area, I will find you." "Okay, I promise," he cracked, quivering. "I won't come back, I promise." "Go then, leave. Go back to the village and remember, I will find you if you come back," she said as Drugan hurriedly stood up to run back along the path. Cam looked back down at her shoulder as she dropped the dagger on the ground, noticing all of the viscous cloudy gray blood oozing from her shoulder. She wiped it with her arm, shaking it off onto the ground. Then she wiped the rest of the soft and sticky blood against one of the trees. "Okay, regroup everybody," she cracked. "We have to walk for a little more time. We have to make sure the Comlugs won't find us again. We can rest, though." Once Cam was done resting with the people, and they all wanted to go, Cam stood up and started walking in a direction. She didn't need as much rest as the humans, but she was fine letting them rest. She didn't need to tell them to follow. They didn't have anywhere to go but follow her, so there wasn't any other choice. So they continued on for another hour into the forest, the air feeling colder as they passed through a valley and over 3 rivers. And then Cam stopped after walking a little past the bottom of one of the mountains. "Okay, rest here. We can start a new village," she cracked, done with walking away from Lugic civilization, not even knowing that this village would end up being the center of all space tech that would eventually come to this new undying universe. New perspective. Zirkle woke up, looking around to see that he had been where he was before. The trail he made in the leaves now blown over as the rest of the Comlugs left. He stood up weakly, still sensing them with his antenna. Where was he taken? Had anything changed? They were gone, but Zirkle only had a faint sense in his antenna. They had been numbed. Zirkle felt dizzy and lightheaded, but he tried to follow the faint scent that had shown through the numbness. He walked out of the circle and trees he had been in, following the scent through the rainbow-colored fall leaves. Zirkle didn't know where it was going, but he was going there like he had done following the path to the circle originally. No matter how far away it was, he would find out where those comlugs had gone. Zirkle didn't actually have to walk that far to find what it was the comlugs had been doing. He could feel the numbing getting stronger, so he was lucky he found it before his antenna fell asleep completely. There was a small opening in the ground, and Zirkle walked up to it and opened it, looking around before he walked in. There's nobody near or around him that could see, but he made sure to check extra hard because he was so dizzy that the only sense of gravity he had was the pressure on his legs. He entered the door in the ground, seeing that there were chairs and other furniture spread everywhere. Wow, they really had made a second ornamentalist base excluding him. It was almost the exact same, minus some of the time they put into it, and the plastered people sitting and crying over in a corner. Zirkle walked in, noticing that no one was inside. He could see numerous devices used for the destruction of humanity. Torture devices, torches, swords, and even primitive grenades made with gravel packed into the shell of a coconut. It needed to be destroyed. Zirkle took a pot full of bosine torch fuel and splashed it onto the tools as he walked back, grabbing another pot to continue spreading the flammable substance. Zirkle spread it over the entire building, and as the sense in his antenna came back to him, and he finally remembered how foul the substance smelled, Zirkle walked out of the building, grabbing a flint rock on his way out. As Zirkle exited, Neckel pushed him in without saying anything. Neckel frowned as he pushed Zirkle into the room, causing him to lose his grip on the flint rock. He fumbled and tried to catch it before it hit the ground, but he missed, and the rock flew out of his arms and farther into the room, striking the ground and lighting the bosine torch fuel. The place lit up fast as Zirkle tried to exit, but Neckel stood in the way. "See what happens when you're on the human side?" Neckel cracked calmly as he closed the door and locked it. Zirkle instantly looked away from the door back to the room, testing where he could go to escape the vast coating of bosine fuel. Luckily, Zirkle wasn't coated with the substance, only his back had a small amount on it. Zirkle looked around for another escape, seeing none. The walls were coated with dried clay. He needed to find a way to break through before the fire in the room got too hot. He ran over to get one of the wooden poles that held up the place, hoping that it would just collapse and that it would snuff out the fire. Zirkle didn't know if he'd be crushed, but it would be better than dying painfully. Zirkle grabbed the log, hoping that something would happen. He pulled the log until it started to make a hole in the ceiling. He kept working the stick as it caught fire. Zirkle had to let go and give up. He kicked the stick down and grabbed the remnant, his back catching on fire. Zirkle rammed into the wall to put the fire out. It barely worked, and the fire had seared his skin and burned his antenna badly. Zirkle rammed the stick into the wall and cracked it way more than he expected it to. He kept ramming the stick into the wall until he reached dirt. Zirkle needed to find a way to close himself in so that the fire couldn't get to him. He needed to go back into the room for a piece of something to cover himself with. Zirkle didn't think as he ran through the growing flames. The room was closed, right? Maybe oxygen would run out. He would just need to stop breathing so heavily and let the carbon dioxide take over. It hurt so much. He found a panel of something and ripped it off, running back to the hole in the wall that he had created. He slotted the panel into place and kept digging outward. The carbon dioxide was nice in his lungs, but it was hot and smoky, which he couldn't breathe. With every new hack at the wall, he felt better. The fire couldn't reach him. It probably wouldn't have been a problem if he had only put it on the weapons. He was amazed at how the grenades hadn't gone off yet. Maybe because the outside was literally made out of something that burns. He was lucky not to have been blasted with hot gravel that would dig into his skin and sear even more. Zirkle grew too weak to dig more, but he needed to continue. He sat up, looking back to see that the fires, for the most part, had gone out. He rammed the stick into it once more as the ground finally broke and he could get fresh air. Zirkle breathed it in, then blew out the smoke-filled oxygen in his lungs, taking in fresh carbon dioxide. He had never felt so relieved. His body felt cold again. The fire was out. He had done it. Zirkle passed out right there, breathing in the fresh air as he recovered. Zirkle woke up after a while, realizing that he should have run away when he could have, and he quietly shifted back into the hole and pushed the panel out of the way. His antenna had been too fried to sense anything, so when he came out he lost his footing and fell to the ground. He stood up, shaking. When he walked to the door, he could see that it had been open. He knew that he needed to go as fast as possible before anyone would see him, so he rounded up the last bit of his strength to make a dash for the woods and hopefully a nice meal. Zirkle took off running, knowing that every fiber of his being was ready. He ran fast into the forest, continuing to run until he would be lost for good, and Zirkle looked back to see Neckle following him. He was trying to be stealthy, but Zirkle knew that he was there by the way the trail in the leaves was too wide to be made by one Comlug. Zirkle knew that he could not outrun him this time, but he could still fight. Neckle caught up to Zirkle, looking him in the eye as Zirkle sat calmly on the ground ready for the classic "Wow, you lived, time to die" speech. But that didn't come. Neckle just quietly walked up to Zirkle as he sat on the ground. "Keep Treff company." And then Zirkle watched as he pulled out an iron blade. Chapter 13. Someone in the Woods. Zirkle hadn't come back yet. It had been a few weeks, and Cam was ready to go look for him, but the Comlugs might follow her back. She needed to stay. For the most part, nobody cared that a Comlug was the founder of their new village. It actually made them proud now that they had done something, and they had done something. Something so great that the borders between humanity and Logika would crumble. Cam had a duty to keep this place running, but it seemed fine enough. They had already started making tools again, although they hadn't been used to construct or farm yet because the majority of the food was coming from fishermen in a large berry forest nearby. Cam headed to the watchtower that had been constructed out of tall but skinny logs, tied together with rope. She listened as the structure shifted and creaked with her movement, but she had already done it countless times before. She knew she was fine. When she got to the top platform, she overlooked the village, looking to the hill that surrounded them. Through the clearing she could see movement. Cam squinted, looking into the forest as she watched a Comlug emerge from the trees, stumbling over its feet. Her mouth tightened as she remembered Drugan, but she could see something glimmering on the Comlug's skin. It was blood. It didn't seem harmful, but Cam knew that she should take a weapon just in case. Cam climbed down the ladder as quickly as she could, grabbing a small stone dagger she had chipped and tied a few days ago that could easily slit a Comlug's throat. She ran over to the hill she had seen the Comlug on, her knife ready. "Hello?" She cracked into the forest. It was less dense here. Behind it was a small field with a few flowers. "Cam?" A familiar voice cracked weakly. "Zirkle?" She cracked, excitedly running toward where she heard him, and she could see him on the hill behind a couple of the trees, drenched in Lugic blood. "Oh my god," Cam said. "Are you okay?" "Yeah, I'm fine. This isn't my blood. It's the Ornamentalists. I killed all of them, with the expense of my antenna. I can still hear a little bit, but my balance is gone." Cam helped Zirkle to his feet and brought him to the village, the cloudy gray blood dripping from him and coating the reddish grass with it. The humans were hesitant at first at the sight of a new Comlug, but Zirkle's right arm was wrapped around her shoulder as she walked him in, and the humans trusted her. They asked her numerous questions about who this newcomer was, none of which she answered then, because the answer hadn't fully set in yet. But as the night passed, Zirkle had a special home made just for him. Cam knew that the answer to all those questions the people asked was that Zirkle was a hero. Thank you so much for listening. In the description is a link to the rest of my books. Bye-bye.